Obviously, it's funny. Oh. All right. We're going through the book of Acts, and I like Acts because it's got all these really interesting stories. And sometimes when you're reading the story, you're saying, there's a point here, but I need to make sure I get the point across. And as I'm reading about what takes place today, a couple things. Number one, haters going to hate. I have a saying, and you've heard me say it more than once. If people like you, you can't do anything wrong. If they don't like you, you can't do anything right. And you're not going to change that. The only thing you could change is somehow get them to like you. Sometimes that's not easy, So, but you find fault, with people who have a different political bent than we may. We find fault with what they're doing. We do it. They do it. They're not going to like me. It's just the way it works. If people like you, you can't do anything wrong. If they don't like you, you can't do anything right. Well, the Jews, they just didn't like Paul. They used to. When he was a Jew, when he was persecuting Christians, then they were the Jewish darling. But now that Paul has, in their minds, turned bad and become a renegade, now, in the name of religion, they're hating on Paul. Everywhere he goes, the Jews are hating on Paul. Now, after leaving Athens, and Silas and Timothy had stayed back, by the way, in Thessalonica. So Paul went to Athens, and now he's down in Corinth. I'll show you a map in just a moment. He is still waiting for Timothy and Silas. And weird things pop into my mind when I think about things like that. When we used to go to South Lake Mall, we went to South Lake Mall the other day. Sears not even there anymore. It's just Macy's and some sort of company that's not retail downstairs, and it was kind of sad. We did all of that was our big gathering place. We went to the mall, and so early in my marriage, I realized that when I go shopping, I have almost no common interest in the same things to look at as my wife does. I mean, just, every once in a while there's this, if you do the Venn diagram, there's a slither there. But it's a tiny slither. And so we would make arrangements. Did you do this? Make arrangements. We'll meet back here at a certain time. And I got to tell you, I was always there at that time. I was always there at that time. And that was pretty frustrating because if the person doesn't show up, what do? You can't go look for them because then while you're gone, they're going to show up and you're not there. Now imagine this. Imagine that Timothy and Silas stay back in Thessalonica. Paul then goes over to Athens, and then he goes over to Corinth, and he's waiting on Paul and Silas. How do you find Paul and Silas? How do you do that? Same thing. So we say Paul and Silas so much, I said Paul and Silas. How does Timothy and Silas find Paul? I'm sure there was a way, but it wasn't cell phones and it wasn't telegraph. It wasn't even by written mail because who do you deliver it to? So Paul is waiting for Timothy and Silas in Corinth. He ends up spending actually 2 years there in Corinth. You got the two biggest epistles. Well, the combined biggest, you got 16 chapters of 1 Corinthians and 13 chapters of 2 Corinthians. You got 29 chapters written to the Corinthians, and most of the chapters in 1 Corinthians where Paul's scolding them because of their lifestyle, and 2 Corinthians is kind of scolding and kind of apologizing for being so hard on them before. But they were a bunch of converts at the church of Corinth, mostly Gentiles, with a sprinkling of Jewish Christians. But Paul spends a couple years there. The most difficult tasks are often the most rewarding. Paul spends 2 years in Corinth. And the interesting thing about Corinth, it was such a hedonistic town. Unlike what most people have ever seen anywhere. Corinth was actually called by many in the 20th and 21st century the Amsterdam of that world, that day, during that time. It was the place you went to sin. It was Sin City. But Paul spends 2 years there, hard years. As a matter of fact, those 2 years he's spending there, he's working as a tent maker. He doesn't want to, he recognizes the carnality of these Corinthians, even after they got saved, and he doesn't want to impose on them, so he's working with Aquila and Priscilla, and he's making tents in their business to support himself and going to the synagogues. Because some of the most difficult tasks end up being the most rewarding. When I started writing Bible Track in 2004, we started reading in 2003, but by the time we got to 2004, I didn't want to send out the same emails with the same notes every day, so I directed people to the web page where I had put them. And just kept adding to that, added to it every year, adding more. And now I occasionally add some things, but pretty soon, after 4 or 5 years, when I've gone through it, I said, hey, I've got a reader's commentary right here. I'm going, whoa. And then people say, well, you should do podcast. So the way, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. It's 180 hours of podcasts for King James and 180 more hours of podcasts for New King James. So every day, for that day's Bible reading, I would go through and I would do a podcast. I'd try to say a week in advance so the podcast would be there when we got to that day's reading. And so after the first year, I did the King James. After the second year, I did the New King James. And today I, for instance, got a check in the mail. Thank you. Looking at the camera when I say that. Got a check in the mail from a guy that I graduated from high school with. His wife found Bible Track. I don't know how she found Bible Track, but turns out that they wanted to donate to Bible Track, all the way from up in Louisville, Kentucky. So that's pretty exciting stuff right there. The fact that something that I had done gets 30 to 50,000 visitors a month, and it's really gratifying. And I've got about 500 or so people listening to the podcast. That's gratifying. And also, I love it, the fact that I've been through the Bible so many times. I kind of know it. Kind of know what's in the Bible. And people talk about, remember where such is? Yeah, I do. Usually I do. I don't always, but things that are tedious and things that are hard, when you look back on them, you think, wow, that's really rewarding. And I know you've got things that you've done in your life that were really rewarding too. Paul had to have been looking back at the church of Corinth and said, wow, that's really rewarding what's happened there. Now, as you can see, Timothy and Silas stayed up in Thessalonica. Then the trip took Paul to Athens. He left them up there to minister in Thessalonica. Remember, he had to make a quick exit from Thessalonica. So he doesn't know, and they're not writing, and he's not receiving, and so he had no communication. He doesn't know if things are good or bad up in Thessalonica. He just knows that they're not here yet. So when he goes to Athens, then he preached and then left, and now he's in Corinth. You can see the trip that he made. There's modern day map with the fact that all of this took place up in Greece. Now, Corinth was an interesting place inasmuch as it had the temple of Aphrodite there. Aphrodite was the patron goddess of Corinth. I guess there's no such word as matron goddess of Corinth, but Corinth was like. Remember, you ever travel down 95? And I don't know if it's still there because I haven't traveled down 95 from North Carolina to South Carolina in years, a couple of decades probably. It's been a long time. And 50, 60, 70, maybe even 100 miles before you get to the border, you start seeing signs advertising south of the border. You know? And then, is it still there? And cute signs. You know, you're having fun reading the signs, and by the time you get to the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, you feel, I need to stop and see what it is. Well, I don't know about now, but back then it was colorful, but not much. I mean, it had some rides and some things. It was the place. If you're traveling, the kids are going to say, yeah, we want to stop there. Well, Corinth was a sailor town. I'll show you why in just a minute. And so if you wanted to hire a crew for your ship, you're going to have better chances of getting a crew if you're going to be going to Corinth. And there was a great reason why they had to go to Corinth. Now, if you can see the map right here, here's Athens. And so if you leave Athens and you want to get up here, you can either sail all the way down here and around, or you can go this way, except there's a problem. There's a strip of land there, about 4 miles wide, that divides this sea from this sea. And so it had a port on each side. Today there's this canal. The canal is only 80 feet wide, so commercial traffic doesn't really go through there. But tourists go through there. But that's the path between that sea and that sea, which kept us from having to go all the way down here. But still, you got the problem. And so here's what they did. About a minute video. So they pull the boat up on dry land. They would turn it around. Wonder what that job paid. So they'd pull it up on the ramp. So they'd pull it on this flatbed with wheels. And then they'd turn the motor on. And they would actually drag it 4 miles to the other sea. So obviously there's nobody in the ship. Where are they? They are out on the town. Now it would have taken, it's treacherous going down and around. The weather's bad a lot of times. And it would take an extra 2 days to go that route. But instead you go there and you got this port city with the temple of Aphrodite, where there were 1,000 probably slaves who were prostitutes who serviced, and they were just servicing for the temple of Aphrodite. That was just part of their religion. So sailors spent their money hand over fist. With 1,000 plus prostitutes, it was a big investment that they were well willing to make, and after they got to the other side, they sailed off and they were happy to go. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. Corinth was a very, as you can see, hedonistic city. As a matter of fact, in 1 Corinthians, Paul's dealing with the problems that existed at the Church of Corinth, because many of those people have been saved out of pagan societies, and things that intuitively seem wrong to people didn't just seem wrong to them because they were brought up with it. Fornication, carnality, adultery, none of that was any big deal with the Corinthians because it was such a hedonistic town. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. Now, I don't know how he happened to hitch up with them. He obviously seemed to have heard about them and was looking for them when he came. They were ejected from Rome in 4950 AD when Claudius just said, "We've had enough of these Jews." Back then you could be anti-Semitic and be ruler of Rome. We've had enough of these Jews, and so he just ran the Jews out of Rome. The Jews were troublemakers in Rome, and so Paul hitches up with them there in Corinth. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. Now Paul, he was bivocational at this point. Now in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul makes the point that I did that because I wanted to minister to you. And Paul makes the point that he was deserving, as were the other apostles. He was deserving of a salary for his work, but because of the carnality of the Corinthians, Paul didn't take a salary from the church of Corinth. And so he's working there in making tents, and then on Saturday he goes to the Sabbath, to the synagogue on the Sabbath. Now he hasn't had a big success in the synagogues in the past. You know, he's been run out of more than one synagogue and been beaten and stoned, but he keeps going. But when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, now it's been a good while since he's seen them, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Why suddenly? I mean, what's he been talking about? Now, a couple of things come to mind here. First of all, I come from a background where people are critical if you don't take every opportunity to go ahead and lay the gospel on them, whether they're receptive, whether you've made friends with them, whether you've warmed up to them or not. But here's Paul. He goes into the synagogues for some period of time, and he's just laying the groundwork. But for some reason, what triggers his jumping in with both feet was Timothy and Silas showing up. And it's probably because they came, we find as we read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, he came with a good report of what had taken place in Thessalonica. He didn't know what to expect. Last thing he knew, he was being run out of Thessalonica. Well, what he finds from Timothy and Silas is they've built a church there. There are people that have gone on in the Lord. And Paul is all excited. He started with Jews there, and look, some of those Jews got saved and a bunch of Gentiles, and Thessalonica is thriving. So Paul then, after Timothy and Silas come back and tell him all that good news, he decides to go into the synagogue this particular week and say, you know that Messiah we've been talking about? Jesus is that Messiah. You know, you ever get discouraged, wonder if you're making a difference? You know, Paul had to have gotten discouraged. 5 times beaten with rods, stoned 3 times. Paul had to have wondered, am I making a difference? And yet Timothy and Silas report that yes, he is making a difference. Satan actually wants us to think that everything we're doing for the Lord is futile. And I talk to a lot of Christians, and it's kind of a scary world for Christians right now. The dynamics of tolerance for Christians, it's changing at such a rapid pace that none of us know what it's going to be like in 10 years, and quite frankly, I'm concerned about that. But I talk to so many Christians who say, well, God's going to do what He's going to do. I'm just not going to worry about it. Well, I don't know what the difference between worry and concern is. But I'll tell you this, when my kids got their driver's license, I was concerned every time they weren't home and they were out in the car. So much so that when Stephen first got his driver's license, we had a prearranged time. It was usually 10 o'clock. On weekends it might be 11 o'clock. And I had to know where he went, and he needed to be home at that time or call me before that time. That was the rule. People used to ask me, do you have a curfew? I don't. I always know where he is and where Julie is, and we have a predetermined time. You've got to be home or call. And so I'd be there in the family room looking out the front window. And I'm up. Am I worried? I was very concerned. I think I was worried. And I'd be up, I'm watching, and the moment those headlights come down the driveway, I would run over, lay down on the couch, close my eyes, and act like I was sleeping. Don't tell him. When you got kids out in the car, if you're not worried, what kind of parent are you? If you're not concerned, what kind of parent are you? Yes, I was always concerned. But here's the thing. Paul had to have had a lot of concern about everything that was going on. But if you didn't act because you're afraid, you'll never get anything done. Your children will never grow up. Your children will never become mature unless you venture out and invest in your good training and just pray that God is going to keep them safe. But they brought this good report from Thessalonica. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, so he mentioned Jesus as the Messiah, been there for weeks now, mentioned Jesus as the Messiah, they opposed and blasphemed. He shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean from now on. I will go to the Gentiles. Which he'd already done one time, but that was in a particular city. So he said, if you Jews are going to reject this, then okay, it's on you. Now, by the way, there was no guarantee of eternal life in Judaism. They only study Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's not in there. The sages have written in the Talmud over the years, they've made things up, but there is no guaranteed future in an afterlife, even in the Talmud. So they don't know. Now, what's interesting about that is with regard to many Christian denominations, a lot of them don't teach that you can know you're going to heaven either. You know a lot of people that if you ask them the question, do you know you're going to heaven when you die? Probably most people who aren't in evangelical churches will tell you, I hope so, I don't know. Well, that's the way the Jews were. They didn't know any details about anything. They just hoped that if they were doing enough, they would make it to heaven. Now, what is doing enough? Is this the level of doing enough, or is this the level of doing enough? What is the level of doing enough? Nobody knows. Therefore, they're just hoping. But we, with Jesus Christ, we know that Jesus said, I in my Father's house have many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Jesus said in John 14:6, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. Jesus told Nicodemus, you must be born again. If you're going to have eternal life, you've got to be born again. So Jesus laid out the answer to the question that all the Jews were struggling with through the centuries. Here's how you can know that you go to heaven when you die, through Jesus, through me, Jesus said. And so Paul's just throwing out what he knows. This church in Corinth was largely made up of Gentile believers. And yet there were a few Jews that got saved. But then as he stayed there for the 2 years, Gentile believers just kept coming, and pretty soon had a substantially sized church there. And he departed after he got rejected from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, who worshiped God. This part is just humorous to me. Maybe it's not to you. Whose house was next door to the synagogue. The people that rejected him probably cussed at him and drove him off. Religious people, by the way. People who consider themselves very righteous but hated on Paul because of his adamant conviction that Jesus Christ is the only way, that Jesus is the Messiah. So he moves from Aquila and Priscilla's house and he goes over to the house of Justus, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Gonna see these people every day as they come out of the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, it's his next door neighbor. You know Paul is wearing him out with Jesus. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. So he goes to this hedonistic town that's got a sprinkling of Jews, probably a substantial population of Jews, and some Jews get saved, but a bunch of Gentiles get saved. So now we got ourselves a church. Now, by the way, this Crispus is one of the guys. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:14, I thank God that I baptized none of you save except Crispus and Gaius. Because they were talking about who baptized me, who baptized me. Well, Paul baptized Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. So now the ruler of the synagogue has gotten saved. That's pretty good progress. You get run out one week, but then you move next door to the synagogue, and with the constant going at it, persistence, the ruler of the synagogue gets saved. Paul has kind of become annoying there, I guess. It's a novelty at first. There you are in the hedonistic city of the Greek Empire, of the Roman Empire at this point. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by vision, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. For I have commanded many people in this city, and he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So there was this Jewish tolerance for a while. They're leaving him alone. He's still ministering. The ruler of the synagogue gets saved. They get another ruler because he can't keep his job if he's a believing Christian as ruler of the synagogue. So they're tolerant of Paul for a while, but then Paul just becomes annoying to them. Kind of like how excited we were when the pavilion came to town. We were real excited. Now you were too. You were back then. Shopping area. We don't have to go to South Lake anymore. That was going to be cool. But as time went on, we're saying, whoa, that pavilion. Afraid to go there. Finally it became annoying. I've heard more than one politician talk about the blight of the pavilion on our county. Well, they put up with Paul for a while, but now Paul has become just a problem. Jewish tolerance for a while, but now when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord. Now, he's a Roman guy. He's like a governor of a Roman province. He's Roman. He's not Jewish. Nothing to do with Judaism. Remember, Sergius Paulus was back in Cyprus. He was proconsul of Cyprus. And so Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. The Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. And by the way, judgment seat is the word bema, Greek bema. And bema means judgment seat. You hear a lot of people refer to the bema seat. Well, that's bema seat. That's judgment seat. That's what that is, because bema means judgment seat. And what it is, it's the place where the person in charge sat on pavement, on a chair, and there he judged the people. And it was called in Greek the bema. And so he's there judging, and the Jews bring Paul to Gallio. And they say, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Whose law? Well, Gallio right away picks up on this. Not my law, mine's Roman law. They've brought him up on charges, on something that he really realizes he has no hand in. He has nothing to do with this. You know, sometimes you just get sucked into a controversy. I found it interesting over the last few weeks to read about the transgender men who have become women, and they're winning these marathons and these races, and they're knocking the women athletes out of winning these because they grew up with testosterone. They've only got to take testosterone suppression treatments for 1 year in order to be able to compete at the collegiate level in the NCAA in all sports, and they're winning these sports. Because, and by the way, this is important to realize, the Equality Act, which has been passed by the House of Representatives, is actually going to, it actually validates that. Now, it's not law unless the Senate passes it and the President signs it. This Senate won't, and that President won't. But if the Senate comes to town that will, and the President comes to town that will, then you've got the Equality Act, and it actually writes in stone this policy. It's already that way in Canada. Just look up on the internet the article about the guy that became a transgender woman. No surgery, no nothing, but now he's going from Brazilian wax parlors to Brazilian wax parlors insisting on a Brazilian wax. Shut one down because they refuse to do it, and the government of Canada says you can't operate unless you equally, service everybody. And so that's already law in Canada. And the Equality Act, by the way, will make it. And I know people think that I'm exaggerating when I say this. The First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees that we don't have to have any pastor that doesn't believe in our values. But a piano player, a janitor, anybody else that works in a non-ministry, the word's ministry, anybody else that works, when the Equality Act passes, if it ever does, then you won't be able to reject having a transgender person work in your church. You won't be able to reject it. Now, the EEOC has already written it in their laws, and while it can be challenged because it hasn't been passed by Congress, you have to have really deep pockets to object to what the EEOC writes and enforces. So, it's hard to ignore what's going on around us. If we ignore what's going on around us, it will be to our peril, because one day we'll say, why didn't we do something back then? Well, let me tell you, now is back then. And we've gotten this far because we didn't do anything. When people, ask me about my political affiliation. Well, listen, I'm fighting for my life and my ministry. I'm fighting for my church. I don't care who the two candidates are. I care what the parties stand for and what they will enforce and what they will do. And that's the only thing I care about. It's never been about personality when I vote. Never, never, never. I voted for some pretty despicable people in my lifetime. People I didn't like at all, but I voted for them because of what they said they would do and what they stood for. Of course, politicians do sometimes stretch the truth. So here's what Galileo says. He says, it's not Roman law. No, I don't have to do anything about that. No, it's not Roman law. And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Galileo said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it's a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters. And he drove them from the judgment seat. So he's saying this, it's just none of my business. Now here's what made the Jews think it was their business. Remember I told you when Paul went from synagogue to synagogue how he dressed? Dressed like a Pharisee. That's why they asked him to speak. And at this point in time, Christianity was considered a sect of Judaism. And so the Jews are taking it upon themselves to police Christianity because they're being associated with Judaism. And Galileo says, no matter, has nothing to do with me, y'all get out. You know, if you've ever been a school principal, you can ask Charlotte about this one. Parents ask you to get involved in the most, they'll say, my child's being bullied. Well, what? Did he hit? What? Shove down? What? No. Somebody said some unkind words to them. What are you going to do about it? Well, did it happen in the class? Did it happen? No. Happened on the way to school. Happened in the playground. Happened. Well, what do you want me to do about it? And so you rebuke the kids and says, don't do that, don't do that. And the parents say, I wanted more. I want you to expel them. Had that happened, I want you to expel them because they've spoken harshly to my child. You're going, man. Well, here's what the asking Galileo was this. I know this is not Roman law. I know it has nothing to do, but I want you to do something about this Paul because he's bothering us. Do something. Make him stop. And so he drove them. He drove them from the judgment seat. Now, at this point, Paul, just leave, man. Because then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the new ruler of the synagogue, Crispus got saved, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Galileo just ignored it. So the last ruler of the synagogue got saved, now got a new ruler, and for some reason they're taking it out on him. Do something. Okay, we're gonna beat you up then. And they did. They beat him before the judgment, right there in front of Galileo, and Galileo says, it's up to you. Go for it. Verse 18 begins, and it's part of next week's message. So Paul still remained a good while. Probably about 2 years altogether. Because sometimes some of the most difficult things, and sometimes the short-term no rewards, get you discouraged, but those end up many times being the most rewarding things that you'll ever do in your life. The most difficult tasks are oftentimes the most rewarding. Let's stand together, please. With our heads bowed and our eyes closed.